Montana Territory. August 1877. The girl was half buried in dust when Gideon Hart rode into the ghost-silent edge of Dry Creek. He had not planned to stop. The cattle were restless, the sun was near setting, and he still had 15 miles to ride before making camp. But there she was, curled beside a crumbling post office, knees drawn up, hair matted with dirt, face sunburnt and slack with exhaustion. No boots, no horse, no pack. Gideon slid off his gelding, boots crunching the dry earth. "Miss?" he asked, voice low. She flinched, then stared up at him, blue eyes wide and wary. "I ain't." Her voice cracked. She swallowed and started again. "I am not stealing. I was only resting. I did not say you were. I will keep moving. Just had to stop. I have to find my children." That stopped him cold. Gideon crouched, eyes level with hers. "Children?" She nodded. Her lips trembled. "Aurelia and Amos. They are 5 and 3. A man he took them. Told me he would bring them food. Then rode off with them. That was..." She blinked hard. "For days ago." Gideon looked over her, saw her scraped palms, the thinness of her arms. She had walked through the heat with nothing but her dress and a broken heart. "What is your name?" he asked. "Faye. Faye Hollis." Gideon stood. "Come on, Faye Hollis. You are not walking another mile alone. You ride with me now." Her head jerked. "Why?" "Because no one should be left behind like that." She hesitated, then whispered, "They said I was no one. When I screamed for help, no one came." Gideon's jaw tightened. They were wrong. He helped her up, the bones of her hand delicate and shaking in his. He lifted her onto his horse, taking the reins and walking beside. As the sun dipped lower, they rode toward his camp. That night, Faye sat by the fire with a blanket over her shoulders, stew warming her hands. She had eaten 3 quiet spoonfuls before speaking. "We were heading to Fort Benton. Heard there might be work. My husband died last winter. We had nothing but the wagon." "Do you know the man who took them?" Gideon asked. "Name was Caleb Meyer. Traveled with us a few days. He seemed kind. Said he had 2 girls of his own back east. He offered to ride ahead, get food. I let him take the children because they were hungry. I thought..." Her voice cracked again. Gideon reached over, not touching her, but close. "You are going to get them back." She looked at him, something flickering in her eyes. "Why do you care?" "I have seen too many women left behind. You are not going to be one of them." She stared at him, then nodded slowly. They spent 2 days tracking Caleb. Gideon found his trail near a dried creek, where a wagon had passed and circled. On the 3rd morning, Gideon stopped his horse and held up a hand. There. They were on a ridge overlooking a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. A tired mule stood tied to a post. Faye's breath caught. "That is Aurelia's shawl." Gideon looked at her. "You stay here. I am coming." He paused, then nodded once. "Then stay behind me." They rode down slow. Caleb stepped out when he heard the hooves. He was tall, thin, with a rifle slung loosely in one hand. "Well now," he said, smiling. "Never expected the mother to come all the way." "Aurelia and Amos," Faye said, voice shaking. "Where are they?" "In the house," he said, then cocked his head. "You planning to take them back?" Gideon dismounted. "You are going to walk away, right now." Caleb laughed. "Why would I do that?" Gideon drew his revolver. "Because if you do not, I will put you in the ground." For a moment no one moved. Then Caleb's smile faded. He looked at Gideon's eyes and saw something there that made him shift his stance. Slowly he dropped the rifle. Inside the cabin, Aurelia and Amos were curled on a bed, pale and quiet. Faye ran to them, arms wrapping around their small bodies. Aurelia blinked up. "Mama!" "Yes, baby," Faye whispered. "Mama's here now." Gideon stood in the doorway watching them. That night, after Caleb had been turned over to the sheriff in the next town, Gideon made camp again. Faye sat beside him, her children asleep under blankets nearby. "You did not have to help me," she said softly. "I know." She turned to him, her face lit by firelight. "But you did." Gideon scratched at the dirt. "I came west after my brother died. Thought maybe I could outrun the grief. Turns out you carry it either way." Faye looked down, then back to him. "Feels like I have been carrying too much for too long." He met her eyes. "Let me carry some of it." She blinked, startled. "I do not mean tonight, or tomorrow, but if you are willing. I would like to stay close, help raise those children if you will let me, and maybe over time be something more." Her lips parted. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you did not give up. You walked through hell for your children. And I know that when I look at you, I feel like I finally stopped running." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his. "I would like that," she whispered. "Very much." Gideon looked at her, heart full. "They said she was no one," he said softly, until the cowboy said, "She is my whole life now." Faye smiled, tears in her eyes. "Is that what you are saying?" He nodded. "It is." And under the wide Montana sky, something new began. The wind shifted over the valley floor, brushing the tall grass with a dry whisper as the wagon rumbled slow behind Gideon's gelding. Faye sat upright on the seat, reins in hand, Aurelia curled against her side, Amos asleep across her lap. Her shoulders had filled out some beneath the borrowed shawl, and the shadows beneath her eyes had begun to fade, though her gaze still drifted long across the open land, as if watching for something she hadn't yet named. "You sure about this piece of land?" she asked, voice barely rising over the creak of the wagon wheels. Gideon, riding just ahead, half turned in his saddle. "It's not much yet, but it's solid ground. Stream runs clear through the back. I can dig a new well once we're settled." Faye looked ahead. The hills were low and rounded here, cottonwood trees scattered like old bones along the banks of a narrow stream. The cabin, tucked beneath a rise, leaned slightly to one side, its roof patched with tin and branches. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, and a pair of crows lifted from the fence posts as they approached. "Was it yours before?" she asked. "My brother Samuel built it. We worked it together for 2 years. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to stay." Faye didn't speak for a moment. Then, quiet, "Why come back now?" Gideon dismounted and stepped toward the porch, boots heavy on the warped steps. "Because it stopped feeling like his place and started feeling like a place we could make ours." Inside, the air smelled of dust and old ash. Faye stepped carefully across the threshold, Aurelia's small hand in hers. Amos clung to her skirts, blinking sleep from his eyes. Gideon opened the shutters one by one. Light slanted in, catching on the motes floating through the air. "We'll need to build bunks for the little ones. The roof will hold through fall, but I'll retar it before snow." Faye set her bag down near the hearth. "I can patch the linens, and I know how to make vinegar wash for the floors. My mother taught me." He glanced at her. "You want this to be home?" She bent to pick up Amos, brushing straw from his collar. "I want a place where I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder, where the children don't flinch at every sound." Gideon nodded once. "Then we'll build it." That evening, she cooked cornmeal mush in an iron pot while Gideon split cedar for the doorframe. Aurelia chased fireflies in the tall grass, her laugh carrying faint and high. By the time the stars came out, a quiet had settled over the cabin, one not born of sorrow, but of rest. Faye stood at the open door, arms crossed. Children are down. For now. Gideon leaned against the porch post, hands dusty and raw. They'll sleep easier here. She looked at him carefully. You never asked me what I plan to do, or where I want to go. I figured if you'd wanted to leave, you would have said so. Maybe I didn't want to assume I had the choice. Gideon straightened. You do. You always do. Faye stepped down onto the grass, the hem of her skirt brushing the tops of her boots. I never had a man say that to me before. Not like he meant it. I don't say things I don't mean. She studied him a long moment. You lost your brother. I lost my husband. Neither one of us asked for what came after. No, he said quietly. But I look at this land, she continued, and I think maybe we can grow something new from it, if we're careful, if we're patient. He looked straight at her, voice low. I'm not in a hurry, Faye. But I'm not going anywhere either. She reached out, fingers brushing his forearm, rough from work. Then neither am I. A breeze swept through the cottonwoods, clicking their leaves like soft applause. Inside, the children stirred, then settled again. Faye didn't pull her hand away. Gideon's voice was almost a whisper. You're not no one. You never were. She looked up, and something in her face softened, something that hadn't shown itself in weeks of dust and sorrow. I know that now. He took her hand fully then, palm to palm, and neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. By late September, the cottonwoods had gone golden. Their leaves clung for now, but the wind had begun to carry the edge of winter. Gideon stood waist deep in the stream, boots braced on the stony bed, pulling the last of the cedar beams across with slow, steady effort. Water lapped cold against his legs, but the work kept his blood warm. Faye knelt on the bank, rolling bandage cloth for the medicine chest. A neighbor from 5 miles east had brought it over in trade, a wooden box lined in felt, still smelling faintly of peppermint oil. She handled each item gently, unfamiliar but willing. You ever set a bone? Gideon called, heaving the beam onto dry ground. She shook her head. No, but I stitched my husband's hand once after he caught it in the wagon brake. He said my sewing needle hurt worse than the break. Gideon chuckled, wiping water from his brow. Sounds about right. She paused, watching him drag the last beam toward the clearing. Why didn't you ever marry? He looked up, surprised by the question. Wasn't the right time. I was always moving. Then after Samuel. Didn't see much point in starting something when I couldn't finish it. Faye stood, brushing her palms against her apron. So what changed? He answered without looking at her. You showed up. The breeze pulled at her skirts, but she didn't move. I don't know what to do with that, she said, quiet. You don't have to do anything. I just thought you should know. She crossed the clearing and knelt beside the beam, helping him align it to the frame. I thought maybe I'd live the rest of my life being grateful for what little I got, not expecting more. You should expect more, he said. You should expect everything. She glanced at him, eyes steady. Then you'll have to keep teaching me how. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Faye sat by the hearth mending a tear in Amos's trousers. Gideon ran a whetstone down the edge of his draw knife, slow and careful. The air smelled of wood shavings and faint smoke. You ever think you'd raise children? She asked without looking up. I thought about it, he said. Didn't think it'd happen like this, but I'm glad it did. They love you already. Aurelia asked if you were going to teach her how to ride. I'll start with grooming. Let her learn the horse before she climbs on. Faye smiled faintly. You think about things. Most men I knew just acted without asking. I've seen what happens when folks don't think first. She set the trousers aside, folding them neatly. I don't want to keep calling you Mister in front of the children. What should they call you? He looked up, surprised. Whatever feels right. They've taken to you. I reckon Pa might come naturally, if that's something you'd want. He set the drawknife down. I'd be proud to earn it. Faye met his gaze across the hearth. Then let's give them that. A home that holds. Gideon leaned back, arms resting on his knees. Didn't think I'd ever feel like a man building towards something again. Not after everything. She rose slowly, crossing to him with quiet steps. You are, though. You are building something. With me. She sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. He didn't move, didn't reach, but he turned his face slightly toward hers. You know what they used to say about me? She whispered. That I was another mouth, another burden. That I'd be nothing without a man to claim me. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, they were wrong. I know that now, she said. He looked at her, voice low and steady. They said she was no one. She waited. Until the cowboy said, She's my whole life now. Faye's breath caught. She didn't answer in words. She laid her hand on his and laced their fingers together. The fire snapped once, and the wind curled around the corners of the cabin. But inside, the quiet held warm and sure. The first frost came just after the full moon. White rime lay delicate across the fields like lace left out overnight. Faye woke before the others, pulled on her wool blouse and stepped outside. The air bit at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. The smell of cold earth and wood smoke curled around the eaves, and she stood for a long moment, watching the sky shift from slate to pale rose. Behind her, the cabin was quiet. Gideon had spent the week sealing the windows with beeswax and muslin, and the warmth inside held through the night. She'd finished sewing a winter coat for Aurelia just yesterday, piecing it together from an old army blanket and spare buttons the peddler had traded for preserves. The horses stirred in the paddock, and the hens clucked soft in their coop. She crossed the yard, scattering cornmeal for the birds, then drew water from the well. Her fingers turned red around the rope, but she didn't flinch. When Gideon stepped out, he was already dressed, hat low over his brow, rifle slung behind his shoulder. She handed him a cup of water, and he drank without a word. You going up the ridge today? She asked. He nodded. Coyote tracks near the chicken run. I'll check the traps, see if they're circling close. She studied him. You think we ought to trade for another hound? Maybe come spring. He set the cup down on the porch rail. We've made do with less. Faye looked past him toward the hills. I've been thinking about planting barley. Just a patch near the east fence. Soil's loamy there, and it'll take to the cold. You planning to malt it? Gideon asked, one brow raised. She smiled. I was thinking more for bread. He nodded slowly. We can clear the rocks this week. I'll help you till the ground after. They worked through the morning, Gideon hauling fence posts toward the north line while Faye scrubbed linens in the wash basin. Sleeves rolled to her elbows, children playing by the woodpile. Aurelia was teaching Amos a skipping chant she'd made up herself, and though he couldn't keep the rhythm, he crowed with laughter each time he missed. Later, with the sun slanting low, Faye stood on the porch, brushing out her hair. Gideon came up from the barn, hands streaked with oil from the plow blade he'd been sharpening. You ever think about schooling? He asked. For the children? For you, too. She tilted her head. I never learned more than letters and sums. My father didn't believe in wasting paper on daughters. He leaned against the porch rail. I kept my brother's books. They're boxed in the loft. Latin, some history, a primer from Massachusetts. She blinked. You're offering to teach me? If you want it, he said. No one ever offered you more than survival. I'd like to offer more than that. She was quiet a moment. I want the children to see me learning, she said at last. So they know it's never too late. He nodded. Then we'll start after supper. That night, once the children were asleep, she sat at the table with a candle lit low and a slate board in front of her. Gideon opened a worn book and traced the first letter with his finger. "This one here," he said softly. "That's A. I remember that one," she whispered. "A for Amos. And Aurelia." He smiled. "That's a good place to start." She drew it carefully, tongue pressed to her lip, then looked to him for approval. He gave it with a glance and they moved on. Later, when the fire had burned low, she closed the book and looked at him across the table. "Do you ever wonder what kind of man you would have been if Samuel had lived?" He didn't answer right away. "I think I would have been smaller, more afraid of quiet things. Grief opened something in me, and it's never quite shut again." She reached across, took his hand. "That's not a wound. That's where the light gets in." He looked at their joined hands. "They said you were no one," he murmured, voice rough. "But they didn't see you carry your children across a state line with no shoes on your feet and no food in your belly." She leaned forward, voice steady. "They said you were just a man with a gun and a horse. But they didn't see you wash a fever from Amos's skin with river water and your own hands." They sat like that, quiet, holding them close. "I never thought I'd love again," she said, barely audible. "I never thought I'd be more than what I'd lost." Gideon's eyes didn't leave hers. "You're more. You've always been more. And I'm yours if you'll have me." She stood slowly, came to him and laid her head against his chest. "I will. I do. I already have." He wrapped his arms around her, not with urgency, but with certainty, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to rest in this stillness. The fire cracked low, and the wind outside swept against the walls, but inside, the warmth held. And in that quiet, they began a life not borrowed from the past, but made fresh from the steadiness of their joined hands. By mid-November, the wind came down from the north sharp and unyielding, rattling the shutters and scouring the ridgeline with bitter breath. The fields were tucked under a layer of dry frost, and each morning Gideon had to break a crust of ice from the troughs before leading the horses out. The cabin, though modest, held firm against the cold, the seams tight and the chimney drawing clean. Faye had taken to rising before sunrise, not out of habit but because she'd begun sewing a second coat, this one for Gideon. She'd measured him while he pretended not to notice, and now each stitch was a quiet promise. She lined it with scrap wool from a blanket she'd never liked, the pattern too loud for her taste but warm enough to serve. "You're going to wear through your hands," he said one evening, watching her thumb the thread through the eye of her needle. "They'll hold," she answered. "You need something thick for when the snow comes." He didn't press further, just leaned his chair back and let the firelight catch the side of his face. The children were tucked in behind the quilt partition Faye had hung weeks earlier, their breathing soft and even. "I got a letter," he said after a while. She paused in her stitching. "From where?" "Old trail partner down near Miles City. Said the Army's moving more stock through Fort Keogh. There's work hauling timber for winter barracks." "You thinking of going?" He looked at her fully. "No. Just means there'll be more trade coming through. Good chance to sell extra hides. Maybe start saving toward a root cellar." "I'd like that," she said. "Not having to salt everything to stone." He exhaled, long and easy. "I was thinking come spring we could put in a second garden plot. Something farther from the coop, where the soil's richer." She set her needle down. "You're not just thinking about this season." "No," he said. "I'm thinking years out." She watched him for a long moment. "I didn't know what that felt like, until now." Gideon stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. "You don't owe me anything for what we've built here, but I want to ask you something." She didn't move, but her breath caught. "I'd like to marry you, Faye." Not because of the children or the land or the way we fit in the quiet, but because I love the way you notice small things. Because you don't waste words. Because you saw me plain and still chose to stay. She blinked once, but no tears came. You want to marry a woman who came to you with nothing but 2 half-starved children and a broken heart? I want to marry the woman who made this cabin feel like a home again, who teaches our daughter to stand her ground and our son to speak with care, who never once asked for more than she needed, but gives more than she knows. Faye leaned forward, her fingers brushing his cheek. Then yes, I want that. I want you. They married with the snow still clinging to the branches. The preacher rode in from 3 towns over, and the ceremony was held in the clearing behind the cabin, with only 2 neighbors and the children as witnesses. Faye wore a dress she'd let out at the seams, and Gideon wore his Sunday coat with the torn lining she'd stitched shut without saying. Aurelia carried a bundle of dried wildflowers tied with twine. Amos stood solemn beside Gideon, his small hand wrapped around 2 pine cones he insisted were lucky. Afterward, they shared bread, venison stew, and cider pressed by the Andersons. The sun dipped behind the hills as they danced slow to a fiddle tune carried on wind. Faye's hand rested at Gideon's shoulder, her steps sure, her eyes steady. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. That night, after the children had curled into their shared bunk and the fire had burned down to embers, Faye lay beside Gideon in the narrow bed they'd finally built together. She traced the line of his jaw with the edge of her thumb. "It's quiet," she said. "It's safe," he answered. She nodded against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have both. You've got them now, and you'll have me. Always." Outside, the wind rattled the dry branches, but the walls held firm. Inside, the warmth was not just from the fire, it was in the way their bodies fit beneath the quilt, the way her hand found his without thought, the way he breathed her name like it was something sacred. The seasons turned. In spring, they planted barley in the east field, and it took root with stubborn will. Gideon dug the root cellar by hand, and Faye packed it with jars of apples, dried beans, and smoked meat. Aurelia learned to ride the gentlest mare, while Amos shadowed Gideon with a wooden hammer he'd carved himself. Letters came and went, but nothing pulled them from their land. That patch of earth, once marked only by grief, grew into something whole. Their love never shouted. It unfolded in the day-to-day, in the way Gideon brushed straw from Faye's hem without comment, in the way she kept his coffee warm until he came in from the barn, in the way the children knew to run to them both when frightened. They had hard days and cold ones, but never lonely ones again. And in the years that followed, when the wind howled across the fields and the snow piled high across the rise, the cabin stood fast. Inside, there was always light, always warmth, always the quiet, enduring kind of love that asked for nothing but gave everything. Together, they lived not just for survival, but for the life they'd chosen, with full hearts, steady hands, and peace that held through every season.